Well, hello, welcome back to our Psalm Bible study. Today we are in Psalm chapter 3. Psalm 3, and our PDF is available for download if you want it. Let's talk about our first couple sections here on the PDF as we get into this. Hopefully you've read the chapter. It's pretty short, as many of these initial Psalms are, and so hopefully you've done that. If you haven't done that, go read it, and then we can come back and we can talk about it here. So if you're ready, let's go. The author of Psalm 3 is David, King David, the second king over Israel and Judah after King Saul died. Now, our next section is New Testament references. We had a bunch in the last chapter. In this chapter, I'm not aware of any references to Psalm 3 in the New Testament. We do, of course, have some themes that run through this psalm. The first one is the salvation of God in the midst of enemies. And then the second one, God sustains us even when we're surrounded in pressures and in trials. Now in our definition section, we have a really interesting word to talk about today. This is the first psalm that it appears in, but it appears over 70 times in the Psalms. It's the word Salah or Selah, S-E-L-A-H. Now, if you're familiar with the Psalms, you're going to be familiar with this. It appears, as I mentioned, over 70 times, but it's really interesting because scholars don't exactly know what it means. It often appears at the end of phrases or statements that are made, but it remains somewhat of a mystery. Some scholars think that it's a musical or a literary pause, calling on the reader to stop and to think about, to ponder what they just read in the last statement. Other scholars propose that its meaning is related to worship, an expression of praise to God, or calling on people to praise God for the truth that was just stated. And still others suggest that it's a literary device that was used by ancient people to mark themes that run through the text. If you look online, you'll find all kinds of interesting ideas, even ideas that I haven't mentioned here, but it's really interesting, and you'll see it a bunch, and so we have to mention it and at least bring as much clarity as we can to Selah. The only other book in the Bible that it appears in is actually the book of Habakkuk, one of the small prophets near the end of the Old Testament. Now, as we go to our outline, we actually know some context about why, when the psalm was written. Interestingly, we're told that this psalm was written by King David when he was fleeing from Absalom. Now, this shows why it's important to read those first couple books of the Bible, because the story that is talked about here, referenced here, is contained in 2 Samuel chapter 15 through 18. So all that historical study, all those kings, all those events that we've talked about in the past are going to enrich our study of Psalms now that we know a little bit about what was going on back then. So if you're not as familiar, Absalom was David's son, and he started a rebellion against David, his father. He brought an army to Jerusalem, ran David out of town, and Absalom planned to take the throne, get rid of his dad, and make himself king of Israel and Judah. David fled the city of Jerusalem. He went east of the Jordan River and ended up going to a city called Mahanaim until Absalom's rebellion was put down and Absalom was killed. And so it's on his flight away from Absalom that this psalm is being written. So only one section here. We only have 8 verses. David calls out to God for salvation when his enemies are surrounding him. In this case, Absalom and his men. David was grieved that he was surrounded by enemies. And David says that his enemies mocked the idea that his God was going to be able to save him. But even in all of these trials, David's faith remained intact. And he said this, quote, you may recognize this phrase, "But you, O Lord, are a shield about me, my glory, and the lifter of my head." If you're familiar with Christian music, you'll know that there's a hymn that uses those exact words, and now you know where they come from. They come from David in Psalm 3. David cried out to the Lord, and he expressed confidence that he knew the Lord heard him. He knew the Lord was going to help him. He says that God was protecting him, so much so that he was able to fall asleep even though his enemies were all around him and pursuing him. And up against thousands of enemies, David was confident that God would defeat them all for him. He concludes in verse 8 saying, "Salvation belongs to the Lord." And so that is Psalm 3. You'll notice that the Psalms aren't really interested in giving us a bunch of details, but rather a lot of them are expressions of thoughts that arose in the moment or sentiments that the writer was feeling. And so much different than like the historical stuff that we've been talking about in the first 10 books of the Bible or so. For application today, I want to talk about how this psalm is a good one to return to when the pressures of your life start adding up, even when the pressures that are pressing in on you are the result of your own bad decisions. Now, you're only going to know this if you did the previous studies or you studied the earlier books. David's family was actually cursed because of a sin that David committed with a woman named Bathsheba. And we're told in 2 Samuel chapter 12 and verse 10 that God's curse was on his household, that there would always be infighting within his household. So when David gets into this trouble with his own son trying to throw him off the throne, that was in part a result of David's previous sin. Now, when Absalom rebelled, it was years after David's sin. He couldn't go back in time. He couldn't fix what he did. There was nothing that he could do about his past mistakes, but he could, in that moment, put his trust in God, which is what we observe in this psalm. What we can learn from this is that when we find ourselves surrounded by mounting pressures, whether those pressures are the result of our previous mistakes or previous missteps of ours in the past or not, the right thing to do in that moment is to put your trust in God and to cry out to Him for help. And I think this is a beautiful application because it shows us that God is still willing to help us even when our troubles are the results of our own stupidity and our own sinfulness in the past. Sometimes I get into the idea of thinking, well, I got myself in this trouble. God's not going to help me now. Even though I've repented and I'm putting my trust in Him, God, He's not going to help me out of this. No, that's not true. That's not what the text indicates. And the application from David here and what he writes in this psalm shows us that God will help us even when our troubles are our own fault. And that's very encouraging to me because sometimes my troubles are my own fault.